I've done a lot of different meetings. Meetings are tough because you only get 6 lessons and there's 21 chapters, so you have to leave a lot out. But Brother Homer Haley worshiped with us for many years, a great Bible scholar on many different things, and the Gospel of John was one of his favorites. And he wrote a book called That You May Believe. And it was about all of the people that came to believe, to trust in Jesus. I tried to get him to write another book, and he told me I had to write my own. And that is, it also includes a lot of material on unbelief. And it explains a lot of people that did not believe, and it explains, you can see the context. What was it that just they didn't connect with? And in my trips to China, I used a lot of the negative material because we were dealing with such a different culture on that. But I got reading through John again. I got roped into teaching a Chinese Zoom class, and that is just strange and wonderful. Trying to make a PowerPoint that includes both the English and a Chinese translation and getting coordinated, and then you can only talk a sentence at a time, and then you got to let them translate, and when they're translating you forget what you just said, and you only get half of the material. Anyway, we're going to go through the Gospel of John tonight, because I began noticing something as I was preparing these classes for my Chinese friends, and that is, well, you'll see this in just a minute. John chapter 20. If you haven't memorized this, memorize it, and put it at the front of the Gospel of John and read it. Put it on a card, and every time you read a chapter of John, read these verses to start with. Many other signs truly did Jesus do in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And believing, you might have life in his name. I just finished a meeting down in Houston area, and I preached on John, and what I tried to do was to use this as the catalyst. What does it mean, Son of God? Why would I believe that? What does it mean that he is the Messiah? And went through that. But again, you only get 6 lessons, and so I had to leave a lot out. But John usually is studied this way. I've mentioned when I went to China, the preachers that had gone before me liked to study the Gospel of John as evidences, and they would have all of the people to memorize the 7 signs, the 7 miracles that were recorded. But we'll get there in just a moment. But what I found is I had to explain to people, when you're reading these letters, they're actually historical documents. They were written back in the 1st century. They were written by people that had been there and done that and seen that and witnessed that. And they wrote these things out, and then they shared them. And each church would make copies and send them to other churches. And you read it as a historical document. I'm not saying it's not inspired. I'm just saying when I talk with people that don't believe in the apostles and inspiration, I start with it, let's read it as a historical document. Let's read it as we would read the Gettysburg Address. Just what do we learn historically from this? And when we treat it as a historical document, what we're going to do then is, if you would read it, then you would read it, and then you would read it. And this is what you would begin doing. And this would allow you to compare, to see where there are mistakes, to see where they contradict themselves, just as a historical document would do. And then you begin compiling the anecdotes, the notes, and the subject matter from that. And through all of that, you now learn what the writer understood during his days and times. And we may not understand everything, but we can understand a great deal. Somebody asked me, we were talking about translation, and if you were trying to translate the Bible out of Greek into the Inuit language, what word would you use for donkey? And I went, reindeer? Moose? They did not have that in the vocabulary. And so there are some things about historical documents that make it difficult because of the history on that. But the 7 signs, these were miracles that Jesus did: the water to wine, the healing of the nobleman's son, the healing of the lame man in chapter 5, the feeding of 5,000 men plus women and children, the walking on the water past the apostles, and the healing of the man that was born blind. How do you talk about him? The ex-blind man? Because he's no longer blind. He was the one that could see. But anyway, and then finally, the raising of Lazarus. And I've told you, the Chinese friends I had, they were so proud of themselves because they'd memorized all 7 of these. And then they would always get really agitated with me because I'd said, you forgot one. No. And they would count them on their fingers. And I said, you forgot one. Because they left off the resurrection. And the preachers that were teaching them left off the resurrection. I kept saying, that's the biggest sign of all that was done. Spent all those chapters. But anyway, so there's actually 8 signs, specific miracles that are mentioned. Now, when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic, because they're the same or the same story, and they were told, and they told a lot more miracles. And John doesn't talk about them. And so he's picked these because he's got a different purpose, that we would understand that Jesus is the Son of God, the power that does that. So what we're going to talk about tonight are not those signs. Those signs signified, that's what the word itself meant. It signified some concept. And what it signified is Jesus was the Son of God. He had the power to do that. But what we're also going to talk about is witnesses. And I got studying this some time ago, and almost every country, well, in fact, every one I found, every country in their legal systems accepted testimony of witnesses. Did you all ever watch Judge Wapner? Yeah, he was one of my favorites. I mean, some of them were pretty bad, but he had some character to him. But what I liked most of all, he would stop people dead. No, that's hearsay. Well, I heard John say to Susie that, no, that's not testimony, that's hearsay. And so when we talk about what's going on here, we're really talking about testimony that is acceptable. And so somebody challenged me one time. They said, if you don't really believe in testimony, I did, but he was just playing devil's advocate here. And he said, prove to me that your mother is your mother. And I had to stop and think about it. Well, I called her mom as long as I can remember. But were you actually born to her? I don't know. I was really young when that event happened. And how do you know? And the answer is testimony. The doctors and the nurses, they wrote out your birth certificate and they pointed out who your parents were and who you were and how much you weighed and how tall, short you were. And so we take that whole testimony on that. And then you have an older brother. And as you start getting older, he says, you were adopted. Oh. And so you begin questioning. But how do you then prove to yourself? You go ask mom, and what's she going to say? So anyway, my point on this is this works in every facet of our lives. We have and accept testimony from people. And so these are not the signs but I want to talk about the testimony, the witnesses that saw and participated and were part of what Jesus did in his life, what they saw, what they heard, what they observed, even sometimes what they touched. Some of them actually ate food with Jesus. They walked with him. They slept in the same area at nights. They were there. This is what John said. What was from the beginning? We have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And that life was manifested. We've seen it. And we testify and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we have seen and what we have heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father, with his Son, Jesus Christ. These things we write, so that your joy may be made complete. Just look at that. Seen, heard, touched, watched, looked at, like you're observing a opera or something. And then they proclaim that. And they're not making these stories up. They proclaim what they saw and heard, so that we can believe in that. Over in the end of John, when Jesus finally appears unto Thomas, and Thomas said, "My Lord," I have a feeling that he was probably bowing, or at least beginning that, "My God." And Jesus said, "Blessed are they who did not see and yet believe." Do y'all realize that's us? And it was a blessing. We actually, in some regards, it's just different. They experienced it in real life, but they experienced only a few of the events. But you and I read all of the events, and I'm not sure which is the more powerful of those. And so we're going to try to make it more powerful tonight on our reading of these. So the 7 signs plus the resurrection, those were a proof, a sign, a visible testimony. But there were many, many, many other people that experienced Jesus in one way, shape, or a form that was would have stuck with them the rest of their lives. What they experienced, some of them were healed. Lazarus raised up from the dead. What they saw, what they heard, what they observed as they watched Jesus doing. Would you have all liked to have listened to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount? Maybe even more powerful than that, if you could have listened in John 17, his prayer the night that he was betrayed. One of the most powerful prayers in all of the Bible. I was studying that this morning, and I just had to quit because I was just getting way too many notes and too many thoughts, and it was just overpowering on that. But our life is to be filled with all of this as we begin dealing with it. Filled with what did they see, what did they say, what did they experience on that. But here's the problem. People lie. My brother lied when he said I was adopted. But people just lie. And we know that. And there are some people that never lie. We had a silly board game. I'm not a game player, but we had a board game. It's called Trust Me. And what you had to do is you pulled a card up and it had something there, and you had to convince everybody else when you read that this was true. And the person that we learned we could not trust is my wife. She proved to be the best liar out of the whole bunch on that. But I would never play that game with her again. Let me try to. And that's how you deal with that. You know, if somebody lies to you, now you don't know, do I trust anything they say? And if they lie to you twice, we know how to deal with that. And so people do lie, and we take into account the idea of credibility. And we know that just is. But another aspect of credibility in a courtroom particularly is the number of people. If you have 5 people that all saw the same event and describe it similarly, there's no doubt that's what happened. What happens if you have 250? What if you have 500? What if you had 5,000? What if you had 10,000? Well, I don't know it gets any stronger after about 200. That's just the way that goes. But the number of people is in John is just astounding to me. And so we're going to look at that. John chapter 2. When Jesus was at Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, observing the signs that he did. What was their names? Where did they live? What did they ever tell when they went home? And so we have none of the testimony written down. All we know is it wasn't just the 12 apostles. It was the feast at Jerusalem. That's probably the Passover, and that was one of the 3 feast days that they went up. But notice again, it says many believed in Jesus because of what he was doing. Most scholars estimate that during the little town city of Jerusalem, this didn't impress my Chinese friends that live in a city of 22 million people, but for us here in, where are we? 100,000 people out here in the middle of nowhere, and they estimate that the suggested population during the Passover feast in Jerusalem, and it wasn't a big city, I mean, we're talking blocks and that, had somewhere between 150 and 250,000 people in that city. And Jesus comes into that city and he begins teaching and doing miracles in their sight. Do you think that spread? How many of you lived in small farming communities? Maybe 1,000 people. And I'm going to tell you what, if you did one thing wrong, everybody in town knew it. But this was what there were. The breakdown of this, the normal population we think was only about 25,000, maybe as many as 80,000 people that lived there full time. But during these 3 Passover or feast days that took place, it is estimated that anywhere from 100,000 to 175,000. And so you had this many people. So picture Jesus and some of these miracles we're going to talk about. That didn't happen out in a cornfield. It happened right here in the middle of these feast days with thousands and thousands of people that were there. What do you think they talked about? I'm going to show you. In chapter 3, Nicodemus, the ruler, he comes to Jesus by night. He was a resident. He lived in Jerusalem, one of those men. And he came to Jesus and he said, Rabbi, we know you have come from God as a teacher, for no one can do these signs that you are doing. Was Jesus actually doing signs in Jerusalem? This is a leader. He's not just a rabbi. He's one of the top 70 Supreme Court type people in Judaism. And what he recognized was, number one, Jesus did these signs. We only have 7, but he did a lot of them. And these signs were there. And they proved to him, convinced him, Jesus is a teacher that is sent from God with the authority of God, the good housekeeping seal of approval upon him. And then Jesus leaves Jerusalem and he goes up through Samaria, which the Jews never did, but Jesus was not typical. He ignored all of those types of social boundaries and he walked right through the middle of that, and he came and he found that woman at the well and he begins talking to her. Again, violated every known moral compass that the Jewish and the Samaritans had. He talked to a woman, just him and her by themselves, and they weren't married to each other. And besides that, she's a Samaritan woman. But he's talking with her, and he's willing to drink out of her cup. Can you give me a drink? And so he's willing to talk about that. And she went back to the city, and she told the men. And you've got to read that whole story. I'm just telling you the end result here. And after that, she said, you got to come see this guy. You got to come and talk to him because he told me everything that I've done. Well, what he did say is you've had 6 husbands and the one you're now living with is not your husband. But how did he know that? And she started as a Jew, as a prophet, and now the Son of God. So she told the men that, and many of the men then believed because of what she said. Is testimony valid? It was to them. They knew this woman, small town. So they then went out, and Jesus spent 2 days with them. I would have loved to have sat there and listened to him teach them and what they were doing, showing them the difference between the Samaritans' false views and Judaism. Anyway, many more believed because of his word. Mitt, I want you to keep track of the number. So we had many, now we have many, and we have... And you see what I'm talking about is, we're not talking 12 or 15. I don't know how many is many, but I'm just trying to picture. And that's what was doing. So then, a nobleman, one of the leaders, political, religious leaders out of Cana of Galilee, a royal official, the way it was translated in the New American Standard. He came to Jesus because his son was at the point of death. And he was distraught. Would you not be if it was your son? And the answer is, yeah. And he came to Jesus and he said, "Sir, come with me or my child is going to die." And what I would have done is I'd have grabbed him by the shirt and by the collar, and I would have started walking. He's going to come. But instead, Jesus says, "Go. Your son's going to live." How many miles apart? He's never seen the son. He doesn't know what the son has got. He doesn't know how sick the boy really is. But he tells the father, "Go." You know, I've always heard in my head, that means trust me. Trust me. And go. I'm not going with you, but trust me. How many of you would have left? I don't know that I would have, but the man believed the word and started off. That's the type of faith that he had. And the father, when he got home, found out it was the same hour that Jesus said go, that his son turned the corner and started getting well and was fine. And he then knew that Jesus was the Messiah. He believed. Not only him, but when he told the family, the whole household believed that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. And then chapter 5, there was another feast of the Jews. The Jews, we think this is a Passover, but we're not sure. But these feast days, people just filled Jerusalem. So we're talking 100 to 200,000 people. By the way, if you like to read Josephus, he said 2 to 3 million. I don't think that was anywhere close to the number, but that. And so there was a patio type area with these big porticos, columns that were there, and a pool that was there. And there laid a multitude. Mitt, how many did you write down for that? 12? 120. Well, for our meetings, that would be a multitude, but just think about that. And they were sick and blind and lame and withered. And Jesus said to this one man, "Pick up your pallet and go." And immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. And who saw that? This was not off somewhere. This was right there in the middle of all of these sick people. They wanted to be healed, but he didn't heal everybody, but he healed this one. And they saw him get up and walk. And then the Jewish people in that town, this just exploded. And they had to talk about it. And so they're talking about it and talking about it. And the Jews were saying to the man, "It's the Sabbath day. It's not permissible for you to carry your pallet." Yeah, but Jesus said, and so his testimony was very simple. Jesus, the man that healed me, told me to do it. And he trusted in Jesus, knowing what was said. And then we get over to John chapter 6. And after these things, Jesus went out to the other side of the Sea of Galilee or Tiberias. And because they saw the sign which he was performing on those who were sick, there was a crowd of people. So we've seen many, and now we've seen a multitude, and now we're seeing a crowd of people. And it was a large crowd that now gathers together because they had heard and seen what Jesus had been doing. So, I don't know, John didn't record that, but what would you think their testimony would be? How excited would they be? In the little town of Capernaum, when the miracles were done. In fact, Jesus upbraided Capernaum because most of his miracles were done there, and they did not believe. He said, even Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented if they had seen this. And yet they didn't. But there were lots of them that did. But in a small town like that, the gossip factor, what would they talk about? And they didn't have TV. They didn't have radio. They didn't have newspapers. What they did was they talked to each other. I saw it again this morning as I was finishing up my coffee. Starbucks had probably about 10 people sitting at all the tables. And you know what they were all doing? Looking at their phones. Not a person there talking. And so they all sat and read their... I'm going to put the stupid things away and talk to one another. But anyway, they would have talked, and so there was a large crowd. And Jesus lifted up his eyes, and he saw there was this large crowd coming to him. And then we learned it was 5,000, you can write this one down, Mitt, 5,000 men plus women. So if all of them were married, we got 10,000. If they all had 1.3 children, so we're talking 10,000 people. And what Jesus does is take the little loaves of bread and 2 little fish and gives them to the apostles and says, share it with them. And they shared, and everybody ate and was filled, it said in verse 12. And then they took up the leftovers. How many of you thought there was going to be any leftovers? And the answer is nobody thought that. And we don't know how that worked. But when the people saw the sign, when they ate the food that was given, what would you have thought if you were at the back row? And they start serving 2 fish and 5 little loaves, and you're at the back of the bus. And to your surprise, when they finally get the little basket to you, it's full. But you've just watched 4,998 men eat their fill, and they did not know how that happened, but they knew it had happened. And that was what convinced them. Jesus is the Christ. Then in John chapter 7, his brother said to him, leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may see your works which you're doing. For no one does anything in secret, and himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Now this is interesting to me because I don't really know how many, if any, they had actually seen. What I do know, in the little town where they grew up, it was a small village. And they would have talked about this. And Jesus had gone back several times and done a miracle or two. And we're going to see some others then. And the interesting thing is, they did acknowledge that people were at least talking about this. Whether they believed it at that time or not, because it says they didn't. Well, I'm not sure they didn't believe he did it or not. They just didn't believe the deduction that should have been made on that. And so then in chapter 7, we have the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we saw the Feast of Passover, and we're going to see the Feast of Tabernacles. We're also going to see Hanukkah later on in that. And again, the Feast of Tabernacles was one of the 3 great feasts. They're the unleavened bread, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost as we call that, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. And so once a year they would go to Jerusalem and they would celebrate these together. And so 100,000, that was the low number. 250,000 was the high number, plus that. And they're talking about Jesus. Why were they talking about him? Man, that's the news. And so they were wondering, where is he? See, Jesus apparently always went up for these feast days. So where is he? He was here last year. Are we going to see him? Is he going to do something on that? And then Jesus came, and they were astonished, saying, how has this man become so learned? Jesus was teaching right there in the area of the temple, and they were marveling at his great wisdom on that. But then there were some, it says there was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him, and some say, he's a good man. And others are saying, no, on the contrary, he's leading people astray. You got to take a position. You can't stand on the fence here, one or the other. If he's a liar, he's not a good man. If he's telling people things that are not true about himself and about you, he's not a good man. If he's telling them they don't have to do certain things you can't have this both ways. And so Jesus now is the center of their conversation. And the Jews were astonished, saying, how did he learn all of this stuff? And then the crowd answered yet again after he talked. He said, you're demon possessed. Who in the world is trying to kill you? Do you all know that answer? Scribes and the Pharisees were already plotting how they could get away with this. And so the crowd doesn't realize that. Look, he's speaking publicly, and they're saying nothing to him. Do the rulers not really know this is the Christ? Do they? And this is one of those things that they expected a positive answer from this. He is the Christ. And so this is the expectation that's going on during the Passover feast. And they are excited. Would you all be excited about that? Been waiting, been hearing, been talking, been taught that the Messiah is coming. And now, last year he was here, and I'm up here this year because I heard about that. And they see that. And many of the crowd believed in him. And they were saying, when the Messiah does come, he'll not perform more signs than what this man has done. Wow. Did they know that he did the miracles? And the answer is yes. That was public acknowledgement. And so a division occurred in the crowd because of him. And the chief priests began pondering seriously how they could kill Jesus. But while they were doing that, Nicodemus, who was one of these of the Sanhedrin, the rulers, he stood up and he said, our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him. Now, we saw him come to Jesus in chapter 3 and said, we know you're a teacher come from God. You're doing these things. Now he stands up. That was scary. If you're the only one, and maybe he was, the Sanhedrin, the 70 top thing, and he stood against them. And then after Jesus was crucified, it was him and another man, and they took all of the spices to give Jesus a proper burial. He was open about it and doing that. But he stood up for him. Then chapter 8 is all negative as far as believers is concerned. But it's an interesting chapter. But in chapter 9, there was a man in Jerusalem, and he was born blind. And if you were born blind, you couldn't work, so what do? You beg. You sit out in the public, and you beg. And so the people would have seen him day after day after day. How many of you would learn to walk by? I don't know. But Jesus doesn't walk by. Jesus heals him. And this man, he keeps making one statement. They keep asking him all kinds of questions about how it happened. And he keeps saying, one thing I know, I was blind, but now I see. You answer it. So after doing that, he knew it. They questioned his parents, and their parents said, we know he was born blind, but now he's in. They questioned the neighbors that lived around to him, all of those that had previously encountered him and seen. So here was a living man, and now it's changed. But he's living proof. And how do you answer it? The interesting thing is, he's standing here with Jesus, and they're arguing against him, and he's standing there, seeing them eyeball to eyeball. Chapter 10, there's the Feast of the Dedication. Back in the mid-Bible period, the Syrian people came down and they desecrated the temple. And they even went inside and offered a pig on the altar, offered it to Zeus and not to God. And so when the Jews rebelled and pushed them out, then they rededicated the temple. And that's what we know as the Feast of Hanukkah. It takes place in December. It's somebody said that's the Jewish Christmas. That's just really a mixing of metaphors here. But anyway, the festival of lights that they had. And a lot of people then went to Jerusalem, to the temple, to see the temple and that. And many then came to him, and they were saying, well, John performed signs, yet everything John said about this man is true. And so, again, Mitt, how many did you put down this time? Are you up? Yeah, you got past the 250, okay? Many came to him, and many believed, verse 42. Then he raises Lazarus. Poor old Lazarus got sick and died. His sisters were distraught, and you can understand if you've lost any of your loved ones. And so they've put him in the tomb, and all of their friends start coming. And many of the Jews came to Mary and Martha to console them. And while the Jews were consoling her, she got up and went out to the tomb because she knew Jesus was going to be there. And so they got up, and many of the Jews got up and they followed her. I don't know how many that is. Smaller number than most of the other many's that we've been talking about. But it was many of them. And the Jews that were with her in the house consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to just weep. And I don't know what she was really expecting, but that wasn't it. But when they got there, Jesus stops before he does anything, and he prays. And I like his prayer. I know that you always hear me, but because of these people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus knew what he was going to do. And so he prays that they can see and understand on that. And Lazarus, come forth, and here comes this ex-dead man, the living dead man, and he's there. And when the Jews saw that, many of them believed in Jesus. I like that. That's that little phrase, in. They didn't just believe Jesus. They didn't that he was telling truth. They believed in Jesus, who he was on that. Chapter 12, the feast for Jesus, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, they're so happy and they've gathered around and they've made this feast day. And most Jews' feast days, they open up their house and that. And so there was a large crowd of Jews that learned that he was there. And they came, not just for Jesus' sake, but that they might see Lazarus, whom was raised from the dead. And they are witnesses. They came and they saw and they talked to. They may have given Lazarus a hug. I don't know what all went on. But there were many, many Jews now that because of Lazarus, and they were believing in Jesus. What were they believing? And the answer is they were believing he was the Christ, the Son of God. They were putting their faith in that. And so at the next day, the Passover begins, and the next day a large crowd came to Jerusalem, and they came to the feast when they heard Jesus was coming. And the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised from the dead, they continued to testify. Wouldn't you? I'd talk about it. tell the story over. You wouldn't get tired of telling it to every newcomer that you saw. And the Pharisees said another, you see that you're not doing any good? Look, the whole world has gone out. They're all going out and believing and trusting and following Jesus. Mitt, how many is the whole world? That's an exaggeration, yes, okay. So, an amazing thing. Though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they did not believe. They had all these witnesses, all these miracles done, all these people, thousands of people that have seen and testified, and they're obstinate. They're believing in spite of the evidence, not for a lack of evidence. And says, nevertheless, many even of the rulers like Nicodemus were believing in Jesus. But because of the Pharisees, they weren't confessing that because they'd have been put out of the synagogue. Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father. I don't know how this situation works out in eternity, but what I do know is they did believe. So then he is arrested. And while they're being arrested, Peter grabs the sword and he whacks off the ear, and they even name him. This was Malchus, the servant of the high priest, and they whacked off his ear. And Jesus touched him and healed him right in front of those that were arresting him. Would you have let him go at that point in time? I would have, but no, they didn't do that. But here's this poor guy. Do you think he picked that up off of the ground and was holding that? And all of a sudden, Jesus put his back in. What I always ask is, when he got home that night and his wife said, what happened? And he said, they cut my ear off. You know, you'd look at both sides and there they are. And so, do you think this man believed? High priest or no high priest? He was there. So, in John's gospel, what I wanted to see and what I was so impressed with is that there were many. In fact, many times it says there were many. And what we have is, we have no idea, but thousands that were there. And then it talks about the crowds. And we know that the crowds that gathered at those feast days were 100,000 people plus those that lived in the city. 200,000 at a whack that would have been there. And then it doesn't say crowd, it says a large crowd. And I have no idea of numbers. Mitch, you don't have to worry about it. Nobody knows. But I wanted you to see, it wasn't 12 apostles in a little room on the day of Pentecost. It was the land of Judea that had been overwhelmed with all of the signs and the people and the testimonies, talking about it and talking about it. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. 3 times the Father spoke from heaven, this is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Then there was the resurrection from the dead. And Paul said in Romans 4, Jesus was declared with power to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead. Then Acts 2 and following the rest, the apostles preached this over and over and over and over. You killed him, God raised him from the dead, and we saw it. We experienced that. And then there were all of these individuals, 5,000 men that ate, all of those. And we didn't even touch all of the miracles. You know, the pigs running down into the lake and the city coming out. And I mean, there was just... And I want you to realize this was not individuals. This oftentimes was groups. And when you see the group having the same vision, this was not a nightmare or a vision, or they saw these things. So, these things are written. Y'all memorize this? These are written in order that you might believe Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God, and believing that, we can have life, eternal life, through Him. Thank you.